At the shoreline of a West African island, a pirate lies concealed amongst the shrubbery, excitedly watching the water. Most pirates would have kept an eye out for ships to rob, but William Dampier was observing a flock of flamingos for the first time in his life. He writes feverishly in his journal, a description that modern ornithologists would fawn over. Then he goes on to describe their excellent taste. Like any pirate would, Dampier shot one of the birds and had it roasted over a campfire. This shows the two sides of Dampier. One was a bold adventurer, eager to earn his fortune from stealing Spanish gold. The other was an explorer, the first Englishman to describe guacamole, the effects of Mariana, and the first naturalist to visit all 5 continents. This is not only the tale of a notorious pirate, but one of the world's most prominent natural scientists and explorers. William Dampier was born on the 5th of September, 1651, in the idyllic village of East Coker. His family were farmers, but due to his keen intellect and curiosity, he was given a good education. We know that he spoke a little Latin and that he had a general knowledge of writing and arithmetics. His brother, George, continued working as a farmer and would even outlive William. After both parents died, William decided to become a sailor. He sailed to France, Newfoundland, and then to Java. When he returned, he signed aboard a Navy warship and fought in the Third Anglo-Dutch War, though he was sick during most of it and missed a major engagement against Admiral de Ruyter. When the war ended, a family acquaintance offered William a managerial position on his Jamaica plantation. William traveled westward, but discovered the position unfit for him. He was very blunt in his reports, and his superiors called him a self-conceited young man. William spent most of his time hanging out with a doctor that could charm snakes. Dampier was not only restless and opinionated, but also a bit of a loner. He found it difficult to commit himself to people and left his job. Next he traveled to Yucatan and traded with the baymen, former buccaneers that had harvested logwood, an expensive material used in the production of dyes. On the way home he escaped the Spanish Coast Guard and endured starvation. Dampier had consistently critiqued the captain for his inability to properly provision the ship. Dampier was never one to compromise his views to make himself more popular. William returned to Campeche, this time as a logwood cutter. He documented the exotic animals, and was so distracted that he sometimes got lost in the wilds or tripped over alligators. He had a sense of poetry and definitely sympathy. When describing monkeys, he expressed much sadness about shooting one and seeing it in pain. Compare that to the French Buccaneer and explorer Ravenel de Lucin, who said that he couldn't recall without laughing the sight of a monkey being shot several times and trying to survive. Dampier often critiqued his wild companions for their excessive drinking and spending. He himself was content to live on a Spartan diet, and he admired hard work. However, he loved the lifestyle of the baymen and buccaneers. The freedom allowed him to explore and document nature in relative peace. Throughout his life he harbored a great respect for buccaneers and pirates, always referring to them as privateers, even when they were obviously operating outside of the law. When discussing his partnership with them, he tends to leave out the details of his own activities, pretending instead that he was an observer that simply traveled with them to explore nature. Truth is that Dampier wanted to make a fortune. By working hard and saving his money, he could get rich quicker. Trade and logwood cutting could only get him so far. His first raid was on the town of Alvarado, near Veracruz. The buccaneers took poor pickings and had to dump it all overboard, when the Spanish sent 7 ships after them. In 1678, at the age of 27, Dampier returned to England with a small fortune. He purchased property and married a noblewoman named Judith. However, he never seemed very interested in her romantically. They never conceived a child and he never wrote much about her. Neither did he write much about women or sex in any of his books, compared to his contemporaries. However, we do know that he stayed with a woman in Virginia for several months. Some theorize that he married her and had a son called Daniel. Maybe he was homosexual, but it's likelier that he was asexual, since he always seemed more interested in nature than people. Most likely he just wanted Judith as someone to manage his estate. After a few months of marriage, he left England, and would not return for 12 years. Though he initially planned to go trading, Dampier's lust for gold drove him into joining Bartholomew Sharp's buccaneering expedition across the Panama Isthmus. Dampier became close friends with 2 other buccaneer scholars. Basil Ringrose was a cleric and a cartographer. Lionel Wafer was a chemist and a surgeon. If you want to know more about this epic adventure, I have a whole video series dedicated to it, which I heartily recommend you check out. They raided the South American coastline without acquiring much loot, and eventually Dampier and Lionel deserted Sharp's company and returned back to the Caribbean under a certain Captain John Cook. In Darien, Lionel was wounded in a gunpowder accident and had to be taken in by the Kuna Indians for treatment. After a year of plundering, Dampier returned to Darien. He could scarcely recognize Lionel. His old friend was heavily tanned, painted and dressed in only a loincloth. Much to Dampier's jealousy, Lionel had learned the Kuna language to perfection. The two friends pirated the seas for a while, until they settled down in Virginia. As aforementioned, Dampier possibly married a woman he stayed with and possibly had a son. He had a parasite removed from his foot by a witch doctor, and narrowly dodged some run-ins with the law. After a few months, John Cook and Lionel recruited Dampier for another piratical voyage to the South Seas. They visited the Cape Verde Isles, where Dampier observed the flamingos, but was otherwise unimpressed by the scrubby vegetation and skinny goats. The young ship surgeon was scammed into buying goat's dung, believing it to be ambergris. In an act of pure piracy, the company seized a Danish ship and renamed her Bachelor's Delight. Naturally, Dampier failed to mention this. After crossing the Straits of Magellan, they did some plundering and exploring. They visited the Galapagos Islands, a volcanic archipelago full of tortoises and colorful crabs. Dampier's description of the Galapagos became the first detailed account in English of those enchanted isles. Some of the hills were so full of fine brimstone that they looked like gold. Captain Cook died from a fever and was succeeded by his quartermaster, Edward Davis. They met up with Captain Charles Swan, who had decided to turn pirate after his mercantile voyage flopped. His supercargo was none other than Dampier's old friend, the ingenious Basil Ringrose. The Buccaneers gathered into a large fleet but split up after failing to attack Panama. Swan and Davis decided to part on friendly terms. Lionel sailed off with Davis, whilst Dampier and Ringrose stayed with Swan. Dampier admired Swan's diplomatic abilities, and I will definitely have to make a video about Charles Swan in the future. After his merchant venture failed, he wrote letters to his wife and investors in London, trying to convince them that it was his crew who had forced him into piracy, and that he would totally give the investors a bigger share. He wouldn't live that long. Anyway, in Mexico, Dampier made notes of the avocado, its abilities as an aphrodisiac, and described how guacamole was made, the first Englishman to ever do so. Swan's scheme was to take the Manila galleon, but much of the crew fell sick, including Dampier. 54 men were sent ashore to gather provisions. Spanish cavalry ambushed and massacred them, including poor Basil Ringrose, much to Dampier's dismay. He was one of the few colleagues that Dampier called ingenious. With the men so disheartened, Swan convinced them to cross the Pacific and try to capture the Manila ship in the Philippines. They never managed to catch the Manila galleon, and Dampier never made his fortune during this voyage either. However, he did meet a lot of interesting people, animals and fruits. His favorite fruit by far was the coconut. He described in length how every part of the coconut could be used, and why it should be mass-produced in the English colonies. The kernel could be used in making broths and oil, but also as food for pigs. Dampier described the coconut-fed pork as the best he ever ate. The water was eaten with rice. The shell could be used for making dishes and cutlery. The husk was excellent for making rope, and even sailcloth. You could even draw and drink the liquid from the tree itself, which Dampier called toddy. This liquid was used in making arak. Dampier was a huge fan of the local boats, called proas. They were masted canoes fastened with a small outrigger boat on the side, preserving stability. Dampier decided to test one out in an experiment where he used a log line to sift through the water in a proa. He discovered that they could travel at 24 knots, much faster than contemporary European vessels. The Buccaneers allied with the Islamic Sultan of Mindanao, hoping to get a letter of marque against the Spanish. Eventually the crew mutineered, abandoned Captain Swan and sailed for China. In Thailand they robbed a Chinese junk loaded with pepper from Sumatra. Dampier admired the Chinese, but he was quite critical of foot binding. Indeed, Dampier despised everything he deemed irrational, and acted meritocratically throughout his life. During his visit in Mexico, a mulatto woman offered to pilot the Buccaneers through the foreign waters. Whilst the crew said no to her, Dampier critiqued them and wanted to put her to the test. He was always open to new customs and ideas. However, he never seemed fond of the French and preferred to stay with Englishmen. He was also a staunch Protestant and disliked both Catholicism and pagan idolatry. Dampier was tiring of his company. They were planning on sailing to India and then to plunder in the Red Sea, but he wished to depart their company as soon as possible. Then the monsoon arrived, driving them ever southwards. After crossing Timor, they arrived in the uncharted territories of New Holland and made landfall. They were the first Englishmen to reach mainland Australia. After some initial failures, the Buccaneers managed to establish contact with the Aborigines. It was the first time the Aborigines saw white men and were naturally terrified. After offering them some gifts, the Buccaneers received their help in collecting water. Dampier was the first person to publish a description of the Australian Aborigines. They wore only some grass around their privates, and they carried wooden cutlashes, probably boomerangs. He admired the Aborigines and their austere lifestyle. They shared their food equally, regardless of age or physical ability, and this resonated much with Dampier's own beliefs in equality and the Buccaneers' code of freedom. After leaving Australia, Dampier and a few others tired of the company and decided to desert them somewhere in the Nicobar Islands. They purchased a boat from a native, and 4 of the Akinese sailors in Dampier's company modified it by adding outriggers, a new mast and sail. Dampier made a fire to dry his journal, which had gone completely wet. After braving storms and other adventures, they ended up in the English factory on Akin, where the travelers rested. After a few weeks, Dampier left aboard a ship bound for Tonkin in northern Vietnam. He was the first Englishman to describe this fine country, its people and culture. He admired the Tonkinese legal system. Instead of imposing fines on offenders, they had to treat the injured to a feast, in hopes that the two would become friends again. Dampier also mastered the art of eating with chopsticks. Dampier returned to Akin, and afterwards sailed to India. At Fort St. George he met with a merchant ship from Mindanao, carrying with it some old friends, including a native slave named Gioli, the Painted Prince. He was covered from head to toe in intricate tattoos. Dampier had previously met and fed the hungry slave, and they became good friends. Gioli's owner decided to give Gioli and his mother to Dampier, and Dampier learned how to communicate with Gioli in a mix of Malay and gesticulating. Whilst Dampier worked as the fort's gunner, Gioli's mother made clothes, and Gioli built a chest and, as Dampier called it, ill-shaped, odd thing, which Dampier nonetheless looked upon favorably. It was no surprise that Dampier took a liking to Gioli. He had always respected and been fascinated by indigenous peoples, especially the American Indians. He often referred to them as just Americans, and had especially made friends amongst the mosquitoes, great allies to the pirates. Gioli and his mother fell ill, and despite Dampier's attempts to nurse them, the mother died. Dampier decided to book passage back to England, where he hoped to make a living by putting Gioli on exhibit. In September of 1691, after 12 years, Dampier had circumnavigated the world and returned to England. We know that Dampier reunited with his wife, Judith, but we don't know anything more than that. He was low on cash, and after his plans to exhibit Gioli failed, he was pressured to sell his friend. The manuscript draft of his book suggested that Dampier was cheated. Though Gioli did receive a lot of notoriety, he eventually died from smallpox, dealing a severe emotional blow to Dampier. Dampier joined a planned expedition to the East Indies, seeking to trade with the Spanish and recover shipwrecks. However, the fleet got stuck at La Corona in Spain, and after a few weeks the company had enough. The chief mate aboard the Charles II, Henry Avery, led a mutiny that seized the ship, rechristened her the Fancy, and took off to plunder the Mughal Empire. Dampier was second mate aboard the Dove galley, and though he might have met Avery, he certainly did not join him. Though he and his shipmates professed their innocence in court, they never received their wages and returned home penniless. In London he re-established contact with Lionel Wafer. Lionel had been arrested for piracy in Virginia, but was freed after royal pardons were issued to all pirates. His stolen silver was used to fund the construction of the renowned college of William and Mary at Williamsburg. Dampier helped edit the draft to Lionel's book about the Kuna Indians, and later supported Lionel's efforts to establish a Scottish colony in Darien. By the time Lionel's book was published, Dampier had published A New Voyage Around the World, and it had become a bestseller. In the years to come, his book would inspire novelists like Daniel Defoe and Jonathan Swift, who wrote the classics Robinson Crusoe and Gulliver's Travels respectively. In the far future, English explorers like James Cook and Charles Darwin would find major inspiration in Dampier's works. He introduced words like posse, serrated, tortilla, and sea breeze. He became a part of the Royal Society, meeting and discoursing with great minds like the astronomer Edmund Halley and the philosopher John Locke. Naturally, a lot of editing and censoring was necessary to conceal his piratical misdeeds, though he still had a reputation as a bit of a rogue. After attending a dinner hosted by Samuel Pepys, the writer John Evelyn wrote that the famous Buccaneer was a more modest man than one would imagine, by the relation of the crew he had consorted with. Unlike most other pirates who lack descriptions or accurate depictions, We do have a portrait of William Dampier, painted by Thomas Murray. We can also presume that years of logwood cutting, fighting and sailing made him strong and robust, but Captain Swan described Dampier as being too lean, and if anyone would eat him, they'd be poisoned. Dampier was certainly very healthy, having survived parasites and various sicknesses, not to mention their bizarre treatments, such as bleeding or lying buried in hot sand. Dampier's books never made him much money. In 1698, the First Lord of the Admiralty gave him captaincy of the HMS Roebuck and the mission to explore Australia. England wanted control of the spice trade, whilst Dampier wanted to explore their lands he had but only tasted. But being an old buccaneer, Dampier was both inexperienced in the ways of the Royal Navy and mistrusted. His harshest critique aboard was Lieutenant George Fisher. Fisher despised Dampier, and in his own words, did not care a fart for his captain. He believed Dampier would turn to piracy, just like Henry Avery had done. The Buccaneers had a distaste for corporal punishment, and Dampier refused to engage in the frequent floggings that were standard practice in the Navy. Fisher had quite the potty mouth. He bade William kiss his arse, and said he did not care a turd for him. Dampier tried to make things up over a bowl of punch, together with Dampier's friends, the clerk, doctor and purser. Fisher called the clerk and doctor Scots dogs, and the purser a great rogue. He claimed that Dampier praised pirates, calling them privateers, and that he would never hurt a hair on their heads. A few weeks later, Dampier snapped and went at Fisher with his cane. Fisher was confined to the brig, where he continued shouting. When Dampier told him to shut up, Fisher said that he could scream as much as he wanted since he was in jail anyway. Fisher was put ashore in a Portuguese port and later shipped back to England. Dampier had no mind to turn pirate. He just wanted to explore. The mood lightened and the rest of the voyage seemed to turn pleasant. When they arrived in Australia, he eagerly documented the various plants and animals. They were attacked by the Aborigines, and Dampier narrowly matrix dodged a javelin thrown at him. When water ran short, he left Australia for good, writing proudly in his journal that he had found some things undiscovered by any before. He visited the Dutch on Timor and the western coast of New Guinea, meeting the natives with their funny hairstyles. He saw a volcanic eruption and named various landmarks after old benefactors, like King William and Sir George Rooke, whose ship he had served on during the Third Anglo-Dutch War, 27 years earlier. On the way home, the rotten Roebuck sprang a leak and was abandoned near Ascension Island. After a few days they were rescued by the Royal Navy, and by August of 1701 he was back in England. Dampier was in deep trouble. Fisher had spent the last 2 years preparing a court case against him, and Dampier was court-martialed for cruelty. Despite his attempts to defend himself, such as accusing Fisher of homosexuality, Dampier's pay was forfeit, and he was banned from ever serving in the Royal Navy.
You have been banned from
the British Royal Navy
for inappropriate behavior.
Whilst Dampier's naval reputation had been tarnished, his scientific one had not, and he wrote and published several more books, such as A Voyage to New Holland, about the Roebuck expedition, and A Discourse of Winds, explaining the winds, storms and waters of the Americas and Pacific. However, before that, he had one more trick up his sleeve to get rich. The War of Spanish Succession had broken out, and Dampier was given command of the 200-ton, 26-gun St. George. His goal was to roam in the Eastern Pacific, and maybe even capture the Manila Galleon. Shortly before leaving London, we get his last written mention of his wife, Judith, saying that he had not written to her about leaving her with a meager salary, and that he knew it would not please her. She must certainly have been quite a character. Dampier made few friends during the voyage, and bickering was frequent amongst the officers. His crew of 120 were a disparate and desperate bunch of Brits, and he had seen finer sailors during his buccaneering days. By now he was rather old, 52 years, and had likewise taken to drinking. He displayed a combination of arrogance, conceit and bluster. Even then, his worst enemies admitted his extraordinary abilities as a navigator. After crossing into the Pacific, the quartermaster had enough and asked to be marooned on an uninhabited island. His name was Alexander Selkirk, and he'd formed the inspiration behind Robinson Crusoe. A few months later, Dampier finally caught the sight of a prize and closed in to engage. The Spaniards blasted St. George below the waterline with their heavy cannons, and Dampier was forced to disengage, lest it sink. Dampier was then accused of cowardice and drunkenness in action, and 6 weeks later was deposed in a violent mutiny, where he was seized by the throat and almost strangled. The mutineers set off in a prize brig, leaving Dampier in the sinking St. George. Somehow he sacked the island of Puna, and somehow he crossed the Pacific in a leaking ship. Sadly, Dampier never wrote a full account of this seemingly amazing voyage. In Batavia he was imprisoned by the Dutch since he could not prove he was a legal privateer. A year later he was released and returned to London in late 1707. Undeterred in his quest for Spanish gold, Dampier travelled to Bristol to lobby for support in another privateering venture. He quickly convinced a 29-year-old captain to get rich by plundering the Spanish in the South Seas, and that Dampier would serve him as a pilot. The expedition received its funding, and 2 ships were fitted out. The young captain was none other than Woodes Rogers. I'm going to keep this voyage short, since I will cover it more in depth in the upcoming video all about Rogers himself, the man who ended Caribbean piracy. Compared to Dampier, Rogers acted more disciplined and intelligently, constantly avoiding mutinies with a combination of carrot, stick and prayer books. They rescued the previously marooned Alexander Selkirk and rowed up the Pacific coast, as per Dampier's commendation. After several months and a brutal engagement, the privateers finally seized the Manila galleon. Aboard they discovered why the galleon had been so well armed. At Manila they had been warned of an English expedition hunting after them, piloted by none other than Captain Dampier. By this point, after almost 40 years of buccaneering, Dampier had become an infamous household name amongst the Spanish. After the battle, Dampier was one of the few officers healthy or unwounded, and his skillful pilotage guided the fleet across his third and final circumnavigation. In 1712 he was back in England. Though Rogers had promised him a large share, bureaucracy from the investors ensured that Dampier received much less. By now, Judith had apparently died, and Dampier retired to live with his cousin, Grace Mercer. Himself, he was in poor health. His mind and memory were failing, as were his eyesight, and he had even lost his inclination to write. He died sometime in early 1715 at the age of 63. His final place of rest is unknown. For a man who had spent most of his life traveling the world, it is sad, but not entirely inappropriate. Obviously, this was just a quick summary of William Dampier's truly epic life. There is so much more to say about his voyages of plunder and exploration, so I am planning on covering them in their own separate videos. Out of all pirates I've ever covered on this channel, he is the most influential by far. The influence left by his curiosity and ceaseless ambition can be felt throughout the scientific world, in geography and the English language itself. Having written so much about sailing and a buccaneer's everyday life, his books are a treasure trove, and you'll find me quoting his works for many years to come. Cheers to you, Dampier. In the end, you finally scored that Spanish galleon. A mastodontic super mega thanks to my generous supporters over on Patreon. Cole Freer, Max Dweck, 1660, Michael Jantz, Rachel, Blunderbomb, Lockar, Dyer, Flintlock, and Ted11. If you want to support me monetarily, please check out the links to PayPal and Patreon in the description below. This is what helps me fund my research and make better videos. Otherwise, please give the video a like and a comment, so the algorithm will spread it to more potential viewers. And why not share it with a friend? Cheers.